This week isn't going to be a week of theology proper. You've got infinite number of weeks for that. What we're going to do is we're going to touch on theology proper in Theology of Counseling 1 and 2 at some point today. I'm going to try to give a brief overview before that, though, of kind of the history of biblical counseling. How did we get to where we are presently? So we're going to spend a little time kind of setting the scene for why we're having this conversation in the first place, and then the implications of theology proper, just very quickly. Several key doctrines that inform the practice. And then this afternoon, to the extent that we can, we're going to go through real change, chapters 1 through 3. Here's what I want to do with this. Here's what our church is doing with this. We're utilizing this as a kind of a foundational resource that we're taking people through regularly as they come to us for counseling. So it's broad enough that when somebody identifies something specific that they want to work through, we can this resource maps onto that fairly consistently. It's going to rehearse the gospel. It's going to rehearse, as we'll see, a diagram that is very useful in the transformation process that we can also call progressive sanctification. So I want us to utilize this first as counselees. So if you've never been a counselee, which you have, to one whether formal or informal, I want you guys to really understand what I would say is a very important perspective for counselors. If you're ever going to be a good counselor, you have to first be a good counselee. We're not practicing a professional counselor model. Okay, we're not professionals. We're not standing above our counselees, looking down on them as they work through their issues, as though we don't have the same challenges or the same issues they do. We are fellow sufferers, fellow strugglers, fellow sinners, and we're seeking to minister to brothers and or sisters in Christ as we walk together through life. Okay, so if you're gonna help people, you first have to experience the help that the gospel offers. And so one of the practical expressions of that this week is we're going to work through this resource together. And I'm going to ask you to meditate and to consider prayerfully what's one thing that the Lord has been bringing to the surface of your heart that He wants to deal with. He wants to maybe utilize this resource this week to help you work through. Could be like when I went through this originally, the issue that I was wrestling with at the time, and continue to wrestle with, by the way, I haven't gotten over this, is what does trusting God look like as expressed in biblical contentment, in godly contentment? What does that look like? It has waxed and waned in my life through the years. All right, I've been tempted to not trust God in certain things, in certain categories. Could be with my business, could be with my ministry, could be with my parenting, could be in my marriage, okay? But I've struggled at times to trust God. And so how do I know if I'm trusting God or not? Well, the scriptures give us this idea of contentment, of godly contentment, as a way of identifying, okay, I am growing in trusting the Lord. So that was the issue I was trying to apply to as I worked through this originally. But I've also struggled with anger. What does anger look like as a sinful anger, and how did that apply as I could work through this a second time? You know, so it's not like you work through this once, put it on the shelf, and you're done, right? This is something we can come back to because it's that general, and it can apply to so many different topics in our life. So that's why I think it's such an important resource that we're utilizing as a local church. So we wanted to get this into your hands And I wanted to work through it this week with you as the counselee. So I love the fact that you're paired up already at your desks. But as if you've glanced through it, it's a workbook, right? It's not a textbook. You're going to be looking at the scriptures, and you're going to be seeking to apply the scriptures, and they're going to invite you on page, on page 12, the end of chapter 1, to do what we're calling a change project. So everything I've been explaining to you right now is the idea of a change project or a growth assignment. Some people might call it homework, okay? Homework in the American context has a negative connotation. People don't want to do homework, right? They despise homework. So what do? We give it a new name, a growth project. That just sounds so godly. How can you not get into a growth project? Who doesn't want to grow, right? So we do this. So whatever you want to call it, that's what we're going to be attempting to do through this resource, okay? So be thinking about that one. Don't think of the Lord, 3 things might come to mind immediately. Then prayerfully ask the Lord for discernment. What's the one I should focus on? Later in your life, you can go back and do the other 2 and the other 20 that come to mind, okay? There's always things the Lord is bringing to the surface in our lives, areas of holiness that He wants us to grow in. And so what we're trying to do is find a resource that we can put in people's hands. Doesn't answer all the questions of their sanctification, right? You're not going to work through this one and done and be more like Jesus in every category of life. This is the ongoing nature of the work of progressive sanctification applied in one particular area of life. So I'm sure there'll be questions, but we'll get into that together later today. So as far as theology proper is concerned, we've got 2 sessions today, 2 sessions tomorrow, and then 1 on Thursday. 2 doctrines each hour, 30 minutes each. Obviously not enough time to even scratch the surface, but simply asking the question of these doctrines is, why does it matter? Why do these doctrines matter in this class? Because this class is all about the practical nature of our theology applied. Okay, so that's what we're doing this week. Trinity Fellowship Pastors College, 2021-2022, Biblical Counseling, Spring 2020. Here's our syllabus. Hopefully you've had it. Hopefully you've looked over it. If not, let's just glance through this really quick. We know this is a foundational course for pastoral practice. Okay? And so there were 5 distinct goals that came to mind in preparation. I've never taught this class before. Okay, so in one part, you're guinea pigs. You're gonna actually help me as things come up that are probably going to restructure this for future teaching opportunities. But here are the 5 goals that came to me in preparation for this class. 1, we want to define the priorities of biblical counseling as a working model for counseling. So I don't know how much of the therapeutic model and the psychoanalytic model that I see in the States, how much of that is translated into Ethiopian culture. Okay, so you're going to have to tell me how much of that is here. I don't know if psychologists run rampant or Christian counselors run rampant or psychotherapeutic models are being utilized. You might not know, but if you do, I want to hear about it. But we want to define the priorities of biblical counseling as a working model because that's what we're going to be practicing in our churches. Secondly, we're going to contrast this model, the biblical counseling model, with modern therapeutic models ever so quickly, and I think Andy will do a little bit more of this next week. But we'll compare and contrast a little bit with the therapeutic models commonly utilized by the broader culture. And again, when I say broader culture, I'm thinking the U.S. We'll see how much of this translates for you, okay? And I would say, if what I've heard is correct, the Western distinctives, cultural distinctives, are kind of making their way into Ethiopian culture, correct me if I'm wrong, through social media, through movies, through Facebook and whatnot. Would you agree with that or would you disagree? You'd agree? Okay, so as you see greater influence from the West coming, one of the things I want you to be thinking of is, what's the worldview that's informing all of that media, and how is that world, the air that the culture is breathing, how is that informing their view of God, their anthropology, their view of man, their view of hope, their view of life, and where are they looking for answers? Okay, because Disney theology is huge. I'm constantly, my kids will even tease me. Like, we'll be watching a movie, and 10 minutes into the movie, I'll be pausing the movie. Okay, guys, what are you hearing? And they're like, Dad, are you kidding me? We're only into the movie 10 minutes. Are you going to do this every 10 minutes? Are you joking? You know, well, I might. But I've tried to learn to wait until the end. But even from the youngest ages, when my kids were just little, you know, Einstein, I forget, Baby Einstein, or Mickey Mouse School, the Clubhouse. Even at the youngest ages, Disney is teaching my kids how to think. They're teaching them where to find answers. Okay? Do you anticipate that from Disney? I wouldn't have anticipated that from Disney, but as a discerning parent, they're teaching that. Then you fast forward as they get older to Marvel, to all of the Star Wars movies, all of these, and this is just one slice of culture, right? Disney, not to mention all of the other categories of media and entertainment. It's all got an agenda, whether it's recognized by the producers and the creators or not. I have to be finely tuned as a pastor. You know, what is my congregation hearing in this? You know, if they listen to enough Disney or Oprah, they're going to hear, listen to your heart. Listen to your heart. You've got the answers inside of you. Is that what the scriptures tells us? No. You got sin in there, buddy. And that sin's going to lead you astray. Do not listen to your heart. Correct your heart. Direct your heart. Instruct your heart. Don't listen to your heart, right? So we're gonna try to understand what are these therapeutic models that are making their way through media. And as you see that influence come in through the West, be on guard against that. And I'm sure there are other influences already here that have already come in just because Ethiopians are as much sinners as Americans are sinners, right? We have these different emphases and priorities, and so we'll talk about some of that. Thirdly, we want to give proper theological, philosophical, and methodological support for the practice of biblical counseling. Okay, what do I mean by that? First of all, we want to ground our practice in good theology. Okay? But our theology now informs philosophically how we view the self, how we view God, the intersection of God and man and Christ and the gospel. And we have to bring all that stuff together, and then that informs our methodology, how we actually practice counseling, okay? Fourthly, we want to integrate biblical counseling as a discipleship-oriented ministry that functions within the broader means of grace within the local church. What you'll not hear, I hope you won't hear me say this, because that's not what I intend. I don't ever want you to hear me say, hey, separate biblical counseling from anything else and just let it be a standalone ministry in your churches. That is not the goal here. The goal is to integrate biblical counseling as an expression of discipleship in your church, so that people hear the word preached on a Sunday morning, okay? They get into community groups or small groups. They live life on life. There's a discipleship, an expression of discipleship ministry there. And then here's a third category of discipleship ministry in biblical counseling when people are stuck in their sanctification. And we can help them get through that, and always as an expression of what they're already a part of on Sunday mornings and in community groups or small groups or whatever you call it. Do you guys have a model of that? Yeah, perfect. So, and then finally, identify how the application of the gospel is the paradigmatic influence that reshapes the counseling process and gives the counselee hope for life transformation. What do I mean by paradigmatic? You understand that word, right? You understand the concept of a paradigm? Okay? And so, here's what I want you to know. You can be a faithful pastor and counsel your people with the gospel. In fact, I would say not just you can, if you're going to be a faithful pastor and if you're going to counsel people, you can be fully confident that with the gospel and the gospel alone, you can help people. You can achieve life transformation in their lives. Now, so we have to understand what's the hope of the counseling process, right? If the goal of the counseling process is to see our counselees be relieved of all the circumstances going on in life that's causing them trouble, well, we're going to fail every time. There isn't a process for relieving all of the suffering and all of the trials and all the temptations, right? Those things are going to continue to exist in our people's lives, just as they continue to exist in our lives. What the gospel does is the gospel informs those circumstances with hope that we can continue to grow through those circumstances and continue to grow into greater Christ likeness. That's the goal, right? Romans 8 tells us that, right? Elsewhere. We've got a goal to be conformed to the image of Jesus Christ. We've got a goal for each of the people in our churches to look more and more like Jesus this week than they did last week. This year more than last year, et cetera, et cetera. We want to see people consistently growing ever so slowly. The arc may not look perfect, but they're ever growing into greater conformity in the likeness of Christ. And the gospel gets us there. A therapeutic model is not. The gospel will get us there, okay? And so that's why you guys read Instruments in the Redeemer's Hand, right? Paul Tripp makes the point, we don't have a 12-step process for people in the counseling practice of the local church. We're not leading people in a process. We're leading people toward a person, the person of Jesus Christ, okay? So we're going to examine the concept of biblical counseling. I'm going to fly through this. I would have put in required resource. I said required resources kind of before we had landed on what the required resources are. We got you Real Change. We got to Consider Your Counsel. You read Instruments of the Redeemer. I could have added that. I would love to see you guys be able to read How Does Sanctification Work, Crosstalk, The Gospel for Disordered Lives. I was able to bring that one. That's kind of a newer resource. So if you have time and you want to pick up The Gospel for Disordered Lives, that's a really useful resources in thinking through the counseling, the practice of counseling. And then The Pastor in Counseling by Jeremy Pierre and Deepak Raju, I think does a great job of making it practical for the pastor in the local church. So I want us to completely work through Real Change together, and I want you to put yourself in the position of the counselee. Okay? So it's going to require a level of vulnerability. You may or may not be really comfortable with that. Nobody is, right? I've been in Japan. I've been in Romania. I've been in the Czech Republic. I've practiced this in the U.S. I can tell you I haven't found a culture yet where systematically people are comfortable with being vulnerable, right? We're really vulnerable with our successes. But when it comes to the struggles of our heart, the struggles of our life, the sin we deal with, there's not a culture out there that's comfortable with revealing that. So if you're feeling like, oh, I don't know that I can trust, I don't know that I can let guys know about this, God says He extends grace to the humble in James 4. So we get to trust Him that as we reveal these things, He's going to meet us with the grace He's promised. Okay? So don't let that hold you back. If you're going to be a good counselor, you have to first be a good what? Counselee. If you can't be a good counselee, if you're unwilling to see the Lord apply His word to your life, you're going to have a really hard time. Not just instructing people, but then walking with them in a gracious way, right? Learning to be a good counselee, it instructs our care of people. It gives us empathy, a biblical empathy, a sympathy. It gives us an ability to engage with them in a way that if we're just the professional, hey, you just need to get past what you're doing. Here's 3 verses, call me in the morning. that model is not going to work. That's not going to encourage people and give them hope as they work through these things. But when you can say, hey, I've applied this to my own life. Here's how God's ministered to me as I've applied His Word and as I've applied the gospel to my own life. That's going to resonate with them. Okay? Let's run through the biblical counseling, the history of the biblical counseling movement as much as we can. I'm going to start by just kind of reading through this. So if you want to read with me, feel free to do that, and then we'll see where we go from there. So this will not be exhaustive. What's important for you to know is how we got where we are and how that affects your work as a pastor in caring for your flock. The modern biblical counseling movement was birthed out of the Christian church's tradition of soul care going back to the early church. The Puritans coined the phrase, but the Scriptures are filled with the concept that those who are rich in their understanding or application of the Scriptures and the hope of the gospel would nourish those around them seeking to grow in Christ. Ministering to the immaterial needs of the human condition is the work of the gospel as it seeks to lead people to an enriched relationship with God through faith in Christ and a flourishing relationship with others. For roughly 1,800 years of church history, the church was the locus of soul care. It was the pastor's responsibility in the community to care for those with varying needs and were otherwise healthy in body. If a person was depressed, struggling with anger, or unwell in their mind in any way, faithful pastors sought to extend hope, help, and comfort through the gospel. It was in the 19th century, between the concepts of Darwinianism combined with the views of enlightened philosophers that led to Sigmund Freud's entry onto the world stage. It was his goal to raise up a generation of secular priests who would replace the pastor when ministering to the soul. People like B.F. Skinner, Carl Rogers, etc., throughout the 20th century sought to extend this reach, offering new theories that diluted both the role of the pastor in society and the efficacy of the gospel ministry of the word in the care of souls. So in the last 150 years, physicians would continue to be responsible for the physical body. Priests and pastors would become particularly responsible for the spiritual nature of man, and psychotherapists would be given the authority on issues of the mind and the soul. Unfortunately, it became all too easy for pastors to consider themselves ill-equipped for counseling-related issues, and they regularly chose to send their church members to, quote, a more qualified counselor who specialized in this work, end quote. This model, however, is established on a basic alteration, as we will see when we consider a biblical anthropology later today, or whenever we actually get to it. What Freud did was establish a third role of caregiver on the premise that man is made up of three parts: body, soul, and spirit. What we know is a trichotomous view of man. The Scriptures are clear, though, that we are fundamentally made of two parts: body and soul. So the dichotomous view, we would say, is the biblical view of man. Biblical counseling recognizes the two-part nature of mankind and seeks to return the care of souls to the church. This movement is primarily meant for believers who seek to live according to God's design, but it also has a pre-conversion evangelistic emphasis that includes ministry to non-Christians as well. We recognize that the psychotherapeutic movement has done a good job on a descriptive level in which we can glean from and utilize much of their research. It's the prescriptive nature of the psychotherapeutic model, however, that we find particularly unhelpful, ineffective, unproductive, anti-God, and ultimately counterproductive to the work the gospel does in the life of the counselee. We anticipate this psychotherapeutic, postmodern, humanistic worldview is the air our counselees and church members are breathing, and seek to help those in our care understand they are not left without an alternative. Whether it's a grandmother's counsel handed down through generations, a spiritualist trying to divine counsel demonically, or a psychotherapist utilizing theories produced by God-haters, the gospel still stands juxtaposed in contrast to these options, fully capable of offering real comfort to those who are broken through sin and suffering. So what has modern biblical counseling movement looked like? The father of the modern counseling movement was a man by the name of Dr. J. Adams. J. had been educated and trained as a psychotherapist and worked in the mental health field back in the 60s. As a Christian, he felt challenged to recognize how psychotherapeutic philosophies and methodologies, combined with the use of psychotropic medications, positioned him to really help people. He began practicing what was originally called nouthetic counseling, based on the Greek term noutheteo, meaning to instruct or admonish. This is the Greek verb used in Romans 15:14 when Paul acknowledged that the Christians in Rome were able to instruct or noutheteo one another. Dr. Adams was used greatly to establish the biblical counseling movement and resist the drift the church had begun by accepting the liberal psychotherapeutic model, which truncated the gospel and the scriptures and relied heavily on other therapeutic objectives and treatments. Adams' contribution was to bring about a return of the sufficiency and authority of the scriptures in the counseling context. Also, Dr. Adams rightly recognized the focal point of sin as the primary issue that needed to be dealt with to help people experience hope. Unfortunately, his model would be seen negatively as identifying sin to the neglect of suffering. It would also be viewed as behavioristic and lacking gospel centricity and a motivation of grace. Consider Dr. Adams the face of the first generation of the modern biblical counseling movement. Coming up behind him and in the same organization he created, CCEF, Christian Counseling Education Foundation, men like David Powlison, Ed Welch, Paul Tripp, and Tim Lane worked to spearhead a second iteration or a second generation. This period of the biblical counseling movement, under their leadership, would bring the issues of suffering and the application of the gospel into proper view so that biblical counseling became nuanced to include transformation in both areas of priority. The robust understanding these men gave us of the application of the gospel helped us understand the value of our counseling wasn't in pointing people to a process of change, but pointing them to the person of Jesus Christ. This transformation is something that could only be accomplished by His grace through faith in His finished work on their behalf and empowered by the Spirit. While this is going on, other ministries are growing in fruitfulness and reach and are beginning to have an impact on the broader body of Christ. ACBC is one of those organizations, previously known as NANC. They followed Dr. Adams' model for quite some time and would be considered in the same vein as Dr. Adams, though they have grown in their application of the gospel and ability to nuance issues of the human heart. Now with the advancement of the Biblical Counseling Coalition, that's the BCC, Biblical Counseling Coalition, the movement is beginning to coalesce into a group that is more or less on the same page and working together to move the experience, the understanding, the practice of biblical counseling in the same Christ-centered direction. From my perspective, this is the third generation of biblical counseling presently, in which biblical counselors are confidently applying the gospel to the counseling needs presented, looking for the Spirit to transform the counselee through its application, the application of the gospel, and doing so together. Instead of being siloed in various organizations, the biblical counseling movement is beginning to coalesce, moving forward with a unity and a synergy that is refreshing and continuing to be developed. Now in this third generation of the biblical counseling movement, those shaping the movement are prioritizing a gospel of grace applied by faith for life transformation, both for issues related to sin and issues related to suffering. Okay? So I think what's really important for I think it's important for you to know is that throughout the church age, pastors would have been looked at as practitioners of soul care. Freud literally made that statement. It was his goal to raise up a body of secular priests, a group of secular priests. That's what he called them. That's what he called psychotherapists, okay? Secular priests who would then steal away this expression of the work of the pastor in the lives of those in the community. And so beginning in the 19th century and extending through the 20th century, this has been the goal. And these guys, as much as they may have a heart to help people, I wouldn't suggest to you they don't have a heart to help people, but at the same time that they may have a heart to help people, they hate God. Many of them on record as saying so. And so what's very important for us to discern is how much of their theories can we accept and include in our practice of soul care. And so what these guys that I'm leaning on, guys like David Powlison, Ed Welch, Brad Bigney, the pastor that at the church that Jordan Lauren grew up in, he's a part of the ACBC movement, teaches all over the country, and guys in that organization, what they will say, and there are guys who have come out of the psychology movement as doctors practicing psychology who have said, yeah, we can't do this anymore as faithful pastors and as faithful Christians. What we can accept is how they've described the issues of the heart and the issues of the soul. But we cannot accept their prescriptions of what it looks like to help move people toward a healthy experience of life. What I've called human flourishing. So we have, what we have through the scriptures, you guys had your biblical theology class, right? Yes. Okay? So what we have in Genesis 1 and 2 is we have this model that God set in place for human flourishing, right? A garden, fellowship, unhindered between God and man, right? This was the perfect experience that we were supposed to enter into. And then Genesis 3 happened, right? And so what we've been living out in our human experience is a Genesis 3 world that has the gospel being applied to it and giving us hope for the renewed fellowship that will come in our glorification when Jesus returns, right? So the whole goal of the arc of biblical theology is a return to the shalom and the experience of fellowship and human flourishing that God had instituted in the garden, someday being renewed. Would you guys agree with that? Okay. If not, I want to talk. I want to hear more. But that's kind of that's the hope we all enter into, right? Okay? And so the question is, how do we get there? The question is, how do we experience human flourishing in a Genesis 3 world as we apply the gospel and experience the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ and the infilling of the Holy Spirit? And my hope is that as we go through this class, you will see a great distinction between the models that psychotherapy offer and the hope that the gospel offers, okay, for real human flourishing. So that's what we're gonna look at, consider, and in some respects we'll just get little sidebar conversations about that, but then we'll really highlight the gospel because, and the reason that I'm doing this, part of our testimony as a couple, my wife and I, is when we were newly married. This is 1997, okay? By 1999, we're 2 years into our marriage, and I am a selfish jerk. I just want you guys to know God has been very kind to me, okay? I was a selfish jerk. I can still be selfish, but I'm not nearly the selfish jerk I used to be, okay? And I was driving my wife into the ground. It's painful to think about how much I hurt my wife. And she entered in, my wife is introspective, she's thoughtful, she loves Jesus. But 2 years into our marriage, she was so depressed. She didn't really care about life the same way that she had before we were married. This is the kind of impact my leadership is having. So if you want to learn how to not be a husband, come see me, okay? And so what we didn't have a biblical counseling model back then. And so what we did is we went to a Christian therapist, a Christian counselor. And so an hour into this conversation with this Christian counselor, my wife is describing her depression, and she's really anticipating hope from this person. And do you want to guess the hope that she offered? A prescription. Medicine. Here's what you need. This is a Christian counselor. I'm pretty sure there was a Bible on the desk or on the coffee table. It was never opened. There was never a sense of Jesus can help you. I've experienced help, and Jesus can help you in this situation. None of that. It was, take this medication. Come see me in a week. My wife got angrier than I've ever seen her in that moment. She could not believe this was the hope that this lady was going to try to offer her. So for the next 2 years, 3 years of our life, my wife went back to school. We went to Dallas Baptist University. She got her undergrad, and then she went on to a master's in counseling because she was going to learn how to help people. So and the school, Dallas Baptist University, was an integrationist school. Do you understand that term, integrationist? Integrationist is the practice of Christian counseling where we try to say, yes, we're Christians, we believe in Jesus, we believe the gospel, but we're going to try to incorporate these different theories, Freudianism, Skinner, Rogerian views of counseling and psychotherapy into our practice in order to try to help people. And so she went, this was all we knew. She went through this degree because her goal was to help people. She graduated with her master's in counseling, and they were told, when you graduate and you begin your practice, pick a theory, the theory you believe is most helpful, and practice from that theory. The problem was she didn't see any hope in any of them. And so she stagnated. She didn't know what to do. And it was at that time we left Texas and we moved to Northern Kentucky, and God dropped us into Grace Fellowship in a Bible-believing, gospel-centered, reformed priorities of the doctrines of grace kind of church. And they practiced biblical counseling, and they had what's called CDT, Counseling and Discipleship Training, that they would do every fall. And so she's a counselor. She learned this. And so, hey, Tyson, I want to go do this. Yeah, I'll do it with you. That's fine. I want to support you in your ministry and in your priorities. So, yeah, I'll do that with you. And she said it was that first weekend of hearing how the gospel applied to all of life, to the real issues of the human heart, that the light bulbs just started going off for her. And that was 2007, and that set us on a trajectory. By 2009, we were certified with ACBC, which really didn't mean a whole lot. It just meant we learned enough that we could start being trusted with counseling scenarios at that church. And we've been practicing biblical counseling and I've been coming alongside guys struggling with pornography, adultery, depression, suicidal ideation, same-sex attraction, marriage situations of infidelity and anger and abuse. And I have seen in many of those scenarios God work in a way that I never could have anticipated, offering real hope for change in these people's lives. And so that's where we're going, okay? I'm excited to start this conversation with you and really hear what you guys are thinking as we go through this week together.